Hey, we're live. Good morning. How's everybody?
Hey!
Do we remember why we're here today?
Contracts.
Yes. Contracts, yes. So last time we made it through, what, about half of the first page? Not quite. Because we're going in pretty deep, right? We want to make sure that you understand every aspect of the contract. What's the most important thing about understanding the contract? Reading it. Yes. You must read it. So we're going to go through it today, but you could probably read it a lot faster than sitting in here watching these whole series of classes. Because we're on day 2, and I guarantee you we'll probably at least reach day 4. So, I mean, we're going to go very in-depth in understanding the contracts. Because I think it's very important that when you're representing a client, that you're truly representing them and understanding what you're doing and understanding what you're having them do and sign, right? Now, when is this class not important for you?
No. When you quit real estate.
When you quit real estate, yes, okay. I'll give you that. Well, give me another answer that's more current.
When you have no business.
When you have no business. So if you have no business, contracts is not really an important thing for you to learn about, is it? Because it's more important for you to focus on what activity? Generating business, right? Okay? I know I sound like a broken record, but I want to make sure you understand that without generating business, you can have the best contracts in the world. No one will ever get to see them or experience them. So get out there and talk to people. All right, so let's keep going. We made it through closing and possession. Next one is holder of earnest money. Who are we going to make the holder of the earnest money? Remember, just to remind you, we represent the buyer in this situation. And so, in most cases, we want to hold the earnest money, right? If we represent the buyer, there's no reason for us not to hold the earnest money. What are some other options?
Seller.
You could have the listing agent. You could have the seller themselves hold it.
Well, no. I mean, seller's agent.
Well, technically, I mean, an option is to have the seller hold it. That does happen. Why wouldn't you want that to happen?
Never get it back.
Well, definitely, it's a little bit more removed, right? Because our license is on the line if we don't handle earnest money properly. But if some random seller doesn't handle it properly, well, then you're talking lawsuit to try and do anything with it. Who's another option that actually gets used a lot to hold earnest money?
Title company.
Our attorneys. Why would you want the attorney to hold the earnest money? What if it's like, I don't know, $1 million house and there's a $100,000 earnest money check?
Law firm's on the hook.
Do you want the law firm to hold it, or do you want us to hold it? This is a harder question than you might think it is.
I would want, if I'm representing the buyer, I want Carl Omega to hold it.
Why?
So that we're in charge if anything should go amiss.
Right? Because we're responsible for it. And at the end of the day, we are the ones, as the brokers, that make the analysis and evaluation of the contract should the earnest money need to be distributed anywhere other than part of the closing, right?
Mm-hmm.
What happens if an attorney is holding earnest money and there's a dispute over whether the buyer or the seller gets the earnest money? Do you
He
know?
wants to keep someone there.
Now, isn't there an arbitration type process that goes through?
Well, for us, there is. There's a process where we go through with a 10-day letter according to the contract, and we'll get deeper into that when we get to it. But I want to, at this point, really point out that most attorneys are not bound by that portion of the contract, okay? Because they're not brokerages.
Mm-hmm.
And so unless you sign an escrow agreement with the attorney that outlines how they're going to handle disputes over the earnest money, more than likely, if there's a dispute, they're going to send you to court. Now, even with a $10,000 earnest money check, who's going to get any money if you go to court?
The lawyers.
The lawyers, right? I mean, not either of the parties, right? And so That's why I always think it is in your client's best interest for a brokerage, preferably our brokerage, to hold the earnest money. Okay? And so over the years, people have done it for convenience sake, or, you know, I mean, obviously, if your commission is only $10,000 and the earnest money check's $100,000, well, yes, at some point, we need to move money from us to the attorney in order for it to close, because obviously that's more money than we're supposed to be getting. And so you have to deal with that, and it does make it a little bit more complicated. And so people say, oh, well, it's just easier. Let's just give it to the attorney, and then they'll cut us a check for commission. Well, there's issues with that. So I want you to understand that. Okay. Speaking of closing attorneys, the closing law firm. What are we going to put in there? I like to put WNCW, and I also like to put where it is, because I want to make sure that we specify what office we're closing in, just to make it clear. To that standpoint, if you're doing a deal with another Coldwell Banker office, or even Coldwell Banker franchise or company, under holder of earnest money, it's important that you clarify who's holding earnest money, which office, which company, that sort of thing.
So
Okay?
we would say Coldwell Banker dash Dunwoody.
We can, if we're doing it with, like if we're doing a co-op deal with the in-town office, we would say Coldwell Banker Dunwoody, because that way, internally, we would know which office, and the attorneys would know which side, which side of the commission statement it needs to come out of, and balance and all that sort of thing.
So what if you're doing, if you're representing the buyer, buying from someone that's in an office?
Well, then only we could really be holding it, right? So it doesn't really matter.
Okay.
And then you will have to clarify for the attorney which side that needs to come out of.
Do you handle things differently if it's a Coldwell Banker that's a franchise?
No, I mean, you would just, maybe you might, instead of saying Coldwell Banker Dunwoody, you might say Coldwell Banker Residential Brokerage.
Okay.
And then they're, maybe Coldwell Banker Armar or whoever,
Okay.
Coldwell Banker Lake Oconee, any of our neighboring Coldwell Bankers. So, yeah, that shouldn't be that much different. But that's part of the reason why I like to do the closing law firm. And then some people do like to throw in a phone number, just so that it's readily easy for everyone to get in touch with the closing attorney. Just as a thought. Okay? Any questions about earnest money holding and closing law firm? All right, next section is the earnest money itself. We have check boxes here, so as always, don't skip a section and leave check boxes undone. If there's options, you need to pick one, okay? Don't think that just because you fill in text, you've automatically checked a box. All right, so the first thing is the earnest money should be paid by either check, cash, or wire transfer. Which one's the best?
Wire transfer.
Nope.
Check.
Check. Why is wire transfer not a great option?
Time frame takes sometimes.
Time frame of delivery. It's a little bit harder to nail down when and if it's going to come through. Secondly, finding it is somewhat challenging. Tracking it is somewhat challenging. Having a physical paper check that we can deposit is much easier for us from a paperwork tracking standpoint to know that we have this, and according to the contract, it's been deposited, and everything's good. Okay?
If you're the seller in the deal and the buyer brings in a check for the escrow money, does that then mean that you should call their bank and say, do they have enough funds to clear this check?
No, and in fact, in today's environment, banks won't even tell you that really anymore. They used to. We used to be able to do that kind of thing, but now they really don't. So it is on the holder of the earnest money to follow that check doesn't bounce, and then when and if that check bounces, to immediately notify everyone, which would have then caused an issue in the contract,
Yeah.
of course, because earnest money is not deposited, and therefore, that would have to be done.
So, Brett, now that we're paperless,
We still have to collect physical checks, yes,
but there isn't any, so we just give the check to,
office staff.
office staff, and then we just send them an email?
No, we still have an envelope that you put it in with all the information.
Oh, okay, so we still have that piece of
Yeah.
paper.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
because
not paperless.
Checks are not paperless.
It's called wire transfer.
But we love
wire
paperless.
transfer, right?
We love paperless.
We do love paperless,
Yeah,
but checks are a little bit easier to track than wire transfers, which would be the paperless version of checks. And so that's the other question. We're in the middle of writing a contract, right? When we finish writing this contract, if we have an earnest money check in our hand, but the contract's not accepted yet, so we can't turn the contract in, right? What do we do with the earnest money check? Do we just put it in our pocket, hold on to it,
Turn it in.
turn it in, right? And so that's the other reason why that's a little bit different than the contracts and things in the paperless, because that goes in an envelope which goes in a safe so that it's secure as opposed to riding around in your car stuck to your visor or something, which would be not a good idea.
And they don't do anything with it other than hold it until the contract's been accepted.
We won't deposit it until we get an accepted contract that references it and would require us to deposit it. So, just by having it doesn't mean anything. It's only until we get a contract. All right, so let's say on this we're going to accept a check because we would prefer a check. Now, here's the other thing. A little bit, this is different than it used to be. Used to be kind of the standard norm was that when you submitted an offer, you needed a check with it, right? I mean, people didn't look at offers very seriously if there was no check associated with it. But that was really prior to due diligence, which we'll talk at length about. But due diligence, of course, gives you the option to pretty much walk away for any reason. And so what has happened is because of that, the need for earnest money to make the contract serious at the time of the contract has changed and pretty much gone away. Majority of agents feel like, well, we want earnest money in there, but we don't necessarily need it on the offer date. So the three options are, as of the offer date, within blank number of days of binding agreement date, and then whatever you want to fill out. Sky's the limit. So the as of offer date, I actually see very rarely these days because it makes, even for you as a buyer's agent, you're putting in an offer, you don't know if it's going to be accepted or not. So why mess around with an earnest money check if you don't even have a binding contract yet?
Right.
And in all reality, if they don't deposit it in, within the 3 days or 2 days of binding or whatever it is that you put in, then you cause an issue in the contract that can be a reason to cause issues. So you just collect it along the way. So I see B as the most common option. Oddly enough, I see B rewritten in C sometimes.
No.
I don't know why that is, but the only reason I would rewrite it is if, for instance, we just had a holiday weekend. And so, gremlins. For some reason, we had a holiday weekend, and we weren't sure whether the contract was going to be binding or not. And maybe it was Wednesday or Thursday of last week, and we were going to put 2 days. Well, we don't want to end up trying to have deposit or collect earnest money over a holiday weekend necessarily. So I helped someone rewrite one the other day, actually, that basically rewrote this, and we wrote in business days in there because that allowed us to make sure that we were beyond the holiday and trying to collect the earnest money.
Brett, tell me why you don't go for A.
I don't have any problem with A. It just means you have to have it. Now, here's the other thing. The other reason that I think we don't do A a lot is because, again, we used to take the client out to the house, show them the house, write the contract on the hood, have a contract, they'd sign it, we'd get the check, and then we'd go deliver it to the person. Then faxes came along, we'd start faxing. Well, now we use e-sign, right? We e-sign stuff all the time. So our buyers may actually go home and kind of think about it, and the next morning we might write the contract, or we might all go home and I'm going to write the contract and I'll email it to you so you can e-sign it. Well, how are you going to get the check? If they're sitting in their house and e-signing the contracts so that you can send them over, well, what could they do? Could they just take a picture of the check and like send it to you so that then you could pretend that you have it as part of the contract? There's a key word. Using the word pretend in real estate's a bad idea. Right? Virtual check, sort of, there.
Well, some people nowadays are putting down a considerable amount of earnest money.
Absolutely.
And not a lot of people walk around with $15,000 in their checking account.
Correct, and sometimes it requires time for people to shift money. Because if you're in a multiple offer situation, to Liz's point, I mean, a mighty earnest money check comes with a big blow, and it can make your offer very strong. I mean, you got a $150,000 house and you put $15,000 down, the seller goes, they're not kidding. They're a very serious buyer. They're not on a string of prayer here hoping that somebody's going to give them all the money to buy my house. They're putting down a chunk of money, and they're putting it down now. So there's something to that. But yes, to that point, most people don't keep large sums of money in their checking account unless their large sums or our large sums are not relative.
So what happens when you're dealing with the all cash buyer? I mean, you still do the earnest money.
You still do earnest money. So it's the same. Earnest money doesn't really matter whether you're getting financing or putting all cash. It's the same. Now, I will tell you that with some banks, if you're buying foreclosure property, if you are paying all cash, they require 10% earnest money.
And
Because somewhat that's their validation that you really are a legitimate cash buyer and you're not just pretending to be one so that you can win the contract. And so there's some of that you have to look at. And to that point, if you are a strong cash or larger down payment buyer, then putting down a larger earnest money check is definitely a signal to the seller that you are a strong buyer, that you're, from a negotiating tactic, that's something that you can look at.
No, it used to be for years that you got $1,000 earnest money period on an average sale under $300,000 or so. But nowadays, with the due diligence and that, people want more money in case you change your mind.
Well, and that's the other thing is from a buyer's perspective. There's so many outs in the contract for you as a buyer to change your mind as you go along that as long as you're paying attention to those, the risk of putting down a large sum of earnest money is much lower than it used to be. And so, with due diligence, whatever that time frame is, if you decide you get up in the morning and you don't like the way your hair looks and that's going to keep you from buying this house, well, okay, you're out. You get your money back. That's just the way it works, and we'll talk more about that. But that does affect this. So here's the other question. If you're doing e-sign, let's go through that, because I want to make sure you're very clear with that. If you're doing e-sign and you mark A that you have $1,000 as of offer date, and you don't physically have a check in your hand, what are you doing?
Making the contract.
Misleading.
You're pretending, right? You're violating your ethics and the law in that that's not true, because you just told the seller that you had the check in hand. Oh, well, I know the client's good for it. They'll bring it tomorrow.
And he gets hit by a truck on his way to the office.
If this says that you have X amount of money as of the offer date, then you have that money as of the offer date. If for any reason you don't, just use B, okay? And make it within 1 day or 2 days or whatever, binding. I've seen a lot of people start to lean towards if I have a 10-day due diligence period, I make it earnest money deposit within 10 days, turned in within 10 days of binding agreement. Because in all reality, as a seller, during due diligence, do you care if I have any earnest money or not? No. Because, I mean, there's no way to lose it during due diligence. If the buyer changes their mind, literally, for any reason, it doesn't matter. So the seller has no rights to that money, no chance of getting that money during the due diligence period. So collecting it during that due diligence period is no different than collecting it the day 1 or day 10. I mean, who cares? Now, the only difference is because we're dealing with paper checks, we do need time for those to clear, right? Now, well, let's get to we'll get to due diligence in a minute. All right. So, but from that standpoint,
So what's
offer date or within X number of days of binding really doesn't matter. It's just make sure it is true, whatever it is that you say.
Wouldn't A still be a risk then if you have a check in hand, but you don't know that it's clear?
No, from the standpoint of, because if you have it in hand, then
Your jacket is sitting there.
seriously, if you have it in hand, then it's going to get deposited sooner. We'll go deeper into that when we get to the paragraph about that, how we're going to handle it.
Yeah, and
So
Tina
what's
feels
typical?
bad.
If you have a 14-day due diligence, then the check would be deposited in 10 days. You think that would be typical?
It takes anywhere from 7 to 10 business days or something like that for a check to fully clear and to make sure that it's
But I mean, if you wrote
Not come
14-day due diligence, then you'd check B and deposit within like 10 days
good.
for a 14-day due diligence.
I mean, for me, I kind of feel like the B is typically what I see the most is somewhere between 1 and 3 days. So it's just enough time so that I'm not having to write a check until we're binding.
Oh, okay.
You know. Now the other thing you got to be careful of though is watch those dates, because if you go binding on a Friday and it's 1 day, guess what? You better be picking that check up from them on Saturday.
Bless you.
You know, so you really need to make sure, which is why I think a lot of people use 3 days, because typically,
Friday to Monday.
even if you went binding on Thursday, well then good, give me the check on Friday. It's okay to be earlier. You don't have to come in on Sunday and turn in the check. So that's, you know, if you use 3, then you're always going to go over the weekend, unless of course it's a long weekend, in which case. So from that standpoint, all right. So let's say I obviously don't have a check in hand, so I'm going to check B, and I'm going to say within 3 days of binding. And our purchase price was $75,000, right? Because we're big spenders this time. How much earnest money should I put in?
1,000?
Any and all of those are valid answers. Okay. Remember, this becomes somewhat of a negotiation tactic. It also relies on, what if I'm a veteran and I'm getting a VA loan for 100%? I'm rolling all my closing costs in. That's why I need my $1,500. Between that and everything else, I'm rolling it all in. I'm coming out of pocket like nothing. That means I don't have any money. Extra money. I mean, obviously I have money in order to pay for the house, hopefully. But I can't put down a chunk of money. $7,500 would not be an option for me necessarily. It might be, but it might not be. Okay? So what would you think the minimum on a $75,000 earnest check would be?
500?
500 probably would.
1,000.
I would think, based on what I've seen, that you could get away with $500 here if you want. Now, if you're in a multiple offer situation, I don't know that I'd go that way. But I think 1,000 is more than enough in this case. But again, every case is different. That's the beauty of real estate, right? I mean, every transaction is different. Every situation is different. Because what you put in here is saying something about your client. If I put in here a purchase price of amount, seller's contribution of 0, and earnest money of some huge, like 10% of the purchase price, what does that say about your buyer?
It's strong and serious.
They are a strong, well-funded buyer, right? If, however, I put in, you know, the full 3% of closing costs and I put in, $500 on a $300,000 house,
Mhm.
what does that say about your buyer?
You don't have any
They don't have any money. And whether you want to say it about them or not, you have to realize that you are telling the other side stuff about your client by what you choose to put in these blanks. Okay? And so you just need to be aware of that. All right. Moving on.
I got a quick question for you.
Alrighty.
You concerned about decimals?
No.
0.00, doesn't matter.
In real estate, we almost never use any cents.
Yes.
All right. That's a good question, but no, we generally don't ever put the decimals in. You can, but it's not really required. Because very little real estate is bought for $19.99 or some random.
97. Jumping into
97, right? Sorry. All right. So due diligence period. Let's talk about how long do we think the due diligence period should be?
The length of the time it takes to process the loan. Like if it's going to be 20 days to get approval on your loan, I think it should be 20 days so that if your loan isn't going to go through, you can get out of it by using your due diligence.
Everybody hear that?
Mhm.
What do you think about that?
No.
Financing contingency spells all that out. If you can't,
It does.
the financing contingency is your timeline on that. You either will get the loan or you won't, and that overrides.
But let's go into a vacuum for a minute. Okay, let's go into an ideal world. We represent the buyer's interest, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so a contract is about the balance of risk. It is which party is taking on the most risk. So if we were to do what Liz suggested, which is to make our due diligence period long enough to secure the loan, where is the risk? Is the buyer's risk significant or not?
No.
Not at all, right? Because they can kill for any reason. Is the buyer's risk higher or lower if you use the financing contingency instead of the due diligence?
It's the same, isn't it?
It's not.
I think it's higher.
I think
Higher.
higher, yeah.
Because think about it, the finance contingency has very specific language
Mhm.
as to why or how or whatever that buyer can get out of the contract. What if the buyer is in a car accident and it burns through, 10 grand over a matter of 2 days for medical and car and whatever stuff, right? All of a sudden, they're in a position where they don't have the cash to close. That is not a valid reason for the financing contingency to kill the contract. Because the financing contingency says very specifically that the buyer must have, at the time of signing, and the failure of having the cash to close is not a valid reason for terminating the contract. But if we do the due diligence thing, can they kill the contract?
Sure.
And they can get their earnest money back, right?
So Liz was right.
So it actually, here's the other side of it. Although asking for a longer due diligence, and I saw the faces in the room as you said that, and I'm glad you said it, because although asking for such a long due diligence period, because typically what's due diligence? 7 to maybe 14 days is kind of the range that we see the most. But asking for a longer due diligence and not having other contingencies because we're going to take care of everything during the due diligence, it's a negotiation strategy. I know several very, very successful agents that their goal is to have as simple of a contract as possible. If they can have only F20 and not have anything else attached to it, they are happy. Because it's less stuff for everybody to have to understand and wrap their head around in the contract. Remember, simple is better most times. And so if you can, now, the reality is that every now and then you're going to go out there and do that, and the listing agent's going to go, no way. And the seller's going to go, I'm not giving you 30 days of due diligence or whatever you need to get that together. Here's your due diligence period, get that done, and then you have a finance contingency. If something happens, then something happens. But there is a difference between those two things, and so you gotta take that into consideration. Typically, most of the time, this is going to be between 7 and 14 days is what I see the most. Okay, that doesn't mean that 30 is not an option. Remember, this contract is about balance of risk. This contract is your job representing the buyer's best interest. And so it's important that you consider that conversation every single time you fill in a blank. Skipping a checkbox may not seem like such a big deal, but at the end of the day, are you doing your due diligence for your client? Are you representing their fiduciary interest if you're skipping a box?
No.
No, you're not. So take the time to make sure that you fill it out all right.
What is the purpose? What's supposed to happen in the due diligence time period?
See, and that's the thing. So agents that have been in the business for a long time revert back to the due diligence is really just the time we do inspections and look for repairs.
Right.
According to the contract, that's actually not true. That is one of the things that you can do during due diligence, but it is not specifically what due diligence is for. Due diligence is much broader than that, which is part of the reason why earnest money prior to due diligence is not really all that important anymore, because the right to request repairs, the way we used to do it, the only way you could get out of the contract is if there was something severely wrong with the property and the seller wouldn't fix it, right? Well, now, like I said, I mean, you wake up in the morning, your hair's not quite right. I don't think I want to live on that side. The house faces the wrong direction.
Feng shui is good.
I just had a bad feeling this morning when I woke up, and yeah, I don't want to buy that house. Do I get my earnest money back?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And so the purpose of due diligence is truly, and we'll read through some of the language, but it is truly to exhaust any and everything that you as a buyer may want to do to understand what this house would be. You know, I know buyers that have driven there at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning and waited until what they thought their normal time leaving the house was, and then driven to work, and done that 2 or 3 days in a row to try and get a feel for what's my commute really going to be like, because I'm coming from a different side of town. I'm trying to understand that, and that's important to them. It depends on what's important to the buyer. That's the thing we can never know.
Remember my Ninja guy?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the seller forced us to change both the due diligence and the financial. They made us do 10 days on due diligence and 15 on the financial.
Yeah.
And we had no choice. It was that or we lost.
Or not get it. Right. And that's the thing, is in a negotiation, I mean, they didn't really force you because they didn't hold a gun to your head, but at the end of the day, they weren't going to accept anything more than that. And as the seller, that's their right. But, I mean, in that case, I think it was an overzealous agent who was too controlling, because I think we have to remember...
The Ninja guy? No.
I think we as agents have to remember these are not our choices. If you pre-fill out this contract and you put 14 days in there and you put all this stuff in there and you haven't talked to your client about it at all, what are you doing?
Malpractice.
Well, not in our case. We don't call it malpractice. But you're guiding them. You're controlling what their decisions are. You're pre-deciding for them that 14 days is good. 14 days is great. Okay, move on. So we're gonna, here's the contract. We're gonna offer $75,000, $1,500, blah 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 blah. Good? Wait, what? This needs to be a collaborative effort here. That's why it's great that all this stuff is on the front page, because all the details are right there next to each other. You don't have to flip back and forth and try to remember, well, did I ask for this or did I? It all relates to each other, right? Fill out the contract with your client, even if they're just on the phone. don't just fill stuff in and have them sign it. It's not your house. It's not your money. If they want to accept 10 days instead of 14, not your call. But on the other side of that, in a negotiation, don't make decisions for your clients. If you don't think it should be more than 10 days, but it's 14 and your seller's okay with 14, your seller's okay with 14. Now, can you give them reasons why 14 or 10 would be better than 14? Sure. But whose choice is it? Theirs. We are not the deciders of which path we go. We are just the guides to say, well, if we go down this path, we're going to end up potentially here. If we go down this path, we could potentially end up here. Which one do you want to do?
And where they give us a range, whether it's on price or any of the terms, they can say it can be between X or Y, and you work it out with the other side. Is that more common?
It's not, actually, because in our contracts, we can't put a range.
No, I understand that.
Now, the seller might.
In the negotiating,
Correct.
in the back and forth between
There
the
might
agents.
be some of that, for sure, in the negotiation itself. But when a buyer, like for the price, we can't say, somewhere between 75 and 85,000. We got to pick a number. And but that's a good point in that, yes, in your conversations with your client, especially when you represent sellers, understanding kind of where they're coming from helps us do that. But we also have to remember that what they tell us today with no contract in front of them and what they decide tomorrow with a contract in front of them are two very different things. Because cash on the table makes people make different decisions. Just does.
My experience last week was the first-time home buyer relies on you telling them what to do. I mean, every time was, Mike, what should I do? Mike, what, so you have to go
and it's
a little
very,
beyond.
and it is definitely very, the more experienced the buyer is, the more savvy the buyer is, the more in control they are. But at the end of the day, what we have to do is with a first-time home buyer that doesn't know anything, which is a lot of our buyers, right? Which is great, because that's one of the best parts of our job, is taking somebody and helping them buy a house for the first time and change the direction. You still have to be careful not to make decisions for them, but yet provide them enough information for them to make the educated decision. Just think about it. If you go out and they decide, well, I like this house and I like this house, which one should I buy? Don't ever answer that question. Right? Because if you answer that question, what happens if you said, well, yeah, house A is the best? Okay, great. We go buy house A, and 2 weeks into it, after they bought the house, they realize whatever, and they hate it. It's your fault. Who do they hate? You, right? Because you shouldn't have made the decision for them. You got to help them make the decision, and that is a big part of our job, is advising them. I like to refer to us as real estate consultants, because our job is to give them the information they need to make the decision. If you think about a business consultant, somebody comes into a company and they consult. They don't say, do this, do this, do this, do this. They say, this is what's wrong. This is the options that you have. You need to make a decision. They don't make the decision for you. They're good consultants. There are some consultants that like to just come and tell you what to do, but that's not, I don't think, a consultant job. Okay? Does that kind of answer that? Okay. All right. Moving on. Due diligence. So so we can say anywhere from 7 to 14 days, whatever, right? Another little thing that some people do, let's talk about it, is business days. Okay? Because 7 business days is very different than 7 days, right? And from an impact negotiation standpoint, Does the seller see the business or do they see the 7?
They see the 7.
If you're competing with another offer that has a 10-day due diligence and yours is a 7 business day due diligence, which one wins?
7 business days.
Just sounds better, right? It's like 1997, right? I mean, it's $20. Come on. But it sounds better that it's 1997. Okay? What you have to be careful of, and we have done this because we see this happen too much, is our contract does not define business days. Okay? So if you get a contract from someone else that has the word business days in it, the words, you need to make sure that they have defined it somewhere, because you don't want to get into an argument after the fact of, well, Monday wasn't a business day. Oh, yes, it was. I worked. Well, no, wait, no. What is the definition of a business day? So we actually, and when we get special steps, I'll show you that we actually have a special step that auto-populates into every single one of our contracts that defines what business days is for us. Because I don't want to get into the situation where we're arguing about what a business day is and what isn't. Okay? But be careful of that. All right. These two little check boxes, A and B, buyer has or has not received a copy of the Protect Yourself from Buying a Home, or the what buyer should know about flood hazard insurance. Which box should you check?
Yes.
Why?
We'll give it to them.
This means you give it to them.
Just give it to them, right?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you give it to them? From a liability standpoint, we talk about the balance of risk. If there's a pamphlet that says, protect yourself when buying a home, and you end up in front of a judge because whatever happened and you didn't give them that booklet, does the judge think you're very good at your job?
No.
Are you more likely to get hit with whatever penalty is possible at that point than if you had given them the little booklet? Right? Give them the book. There's no reason not to. Here's the question. I'm selling somebody a condo. It's 30 stories up in a high-rise. Do I give them the pamphlet about flood insurance, flood hazard stuff?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I do.
Did you see on the news this morning?
No.
There's a high-rise on Peachtree down by 14th
Oh, I saw
Street,
that.
and 13 floors are flooded.
Oosh.
And the
Pipe burst.
tenants
Yep.
are being put into
Yep.
hotels temporarily. So
I don't see any reason, like if I could do it, I would go into the system and have it automatically check both of those boxes on every contract. Because from my standpoint, there is never, ever, ever a reason that you would not give the buyer that you're writing a contract for both of those pamphlets.
It would be nice if it was attached to the contract, wouldn't it? You know, like as a,
That might be too much.
So easy.
And from a standpoint, I don't want the contract package to be so large that it's unmanageable, because it could very quickly get to be 100 pages, which is not a fileable contract.
So is it sufficient just to email it to them?
Yes,
I e-sign mine.
you
I
can.
said because then you have a signature that you know they received it.
You can.
I just think it's so easy. You just attach it, put the signature.
From the
you're
standpoint,
done.
if this is checked and they initial the bottom of this page, they're acknowledging receipt of it. Okay, so you're covered from that standpoint. I definitely know a lot of agents that go the extra mile and have them. I have a couple that actually have them initial your e-sign every single page of the booklet. I think that might be overkill. I mean, we got to treat them like adults. But it might not be either, because we talk about it being bulletproof. If they had to initial every page, they at least looked at that page, right? So we know that they looked at that page. If there's something on that page that they come back and say they didn't know, I'm sorry, you initialed the page that actually says that. So did you not even bother to look at the page that you were initialing?
Did we used to have to initial as a buyer? I just
On
remember
contracts,
on
yes.
contracts having to do that.
Some of our
Okay.
contracts over the years, every page has been initial. And some agents to this day still, on a contract like this, they will make the client's initial every single page. Okay? It's not a bad practice. Because it is that, if you initialed the page, you had to at least have looked at it, right?
when I meet a customer for the first time, I take them these brochures
Sure.
and give them to them and tell them in their spare time to be sure to read them because it will, you know, when you do a contract, it will refer to these. And it's a good idea for them to review.
Absolutely.
And then I was just explaining, while driving around, I will touch on different things
Parts of,
that I think are very, and I will tell them, this is in the contract, you know. One of the main,
well, we're going to get through it all, so we'll hopefully cover those. But definitely, I mean, those pamphlets should be a part of your initial delivery. Don't wait to send them to them. Remember, we create this folder and this whole buyer packet when we create the buyer brokerage. When does the buyer brokerage get signed?
when you read them.
First possible moment, right? Earliest possible process. Okay? So, and this is not really that class, but it's important for you to know, deliver all of the information they need sooner rather than later. Now, some people like to deliver it in pieces because it's more digestible that way. You got to just kind of read your client and know. If I give them a stack of paper that thick, or I send them 15 emails, they're going to go, yeah, whatever. So maybe I spread it out a little bit. Okay. All right. So that covers our little packets. Next one down here is lead-based paint. This is a simple, factual question. Okay. The property was or was not built prior to 1978. Right? This is an easy, simple question. So if the house was built in 1985, do you check was or was not built prior to 78? Was not, right? What if you leave this blank?
Then you don't know how old the house is.
And you're potentially at risk of being audited by the EPA and getting fines of thousands and thousands of dollars.
What do you do? My house was built in 1978. What do you do?
So if it was built in 78, it was. If it's on the line, we're going to err towards the was. Okay? Now, not so easy factual piece of this line is that it says, including any portion thereof or painted fixture therein. A builder built a brand new house in 2014, used antique painted mantles throughout the house that are from the 70s or earlier,
1900.
1900. Now we're going to check. Was. If you know, and it's very important that you know that when you ask. And usually if you walk through the house, I mean, you kind of hopefully tell. And if you can't tell, then you have to just go with what you know. Okay? And so if you walk through a house and it's not blatantly obvious that all of the wall fixtures and everything in this room are actually from, 1920s.
That's why there's a disclosure.
And it should be on the disclosure as to whether it was or was not. So you kind of go with that. If you mark was, what do you need? Lead-based paint exhibit. Okay? If you mark was not, what do you not need? Is there a time when you would want the lead-based paint exhibit and have it marked was not?
If you got what we just said.
No.
Something in the house that,
You would not. Because if it's not required, we don't want it. Okay? There are different feelings on that from different attorneys and different brokerages. From our standpoint, if the house wasn't built prior to 1978, or it's not blatantly obvious that there's stuff in it that was from prior to 1978 that's painted, we don't want a lead-based paint disclosure. You know why? Because if we have a lead-based paint disclosure and there's issues with it, and the EPA audits us, guess what? Even though it wasn't required, they're still going to fine you because it wasn't done properly. Okay?
that means you gave it to them and you didn't have to give it to them?
Correct. So they don't mess around. I mean, they literally find, I think it's $10,000 a mistake.
So,
And a mistake is missing a checkbox. The seller initialing the wrong spot. Not initialing, but signing is a mistake. Not putting the date is a mistake.
So are you,
The lead-based paint exhibit, which we will go through in great detail, literally has hundreds of thousands of dollars of fines possible on it.
Right.
And you don't want that.
so are you saying that if you by accident gave somebody the lead-based paint exhibit and it wasn't necessary, then you should have checked that box on that form? So that, is that what you're saying?
I'm saying that this should be checked appropriately. It either was or it was not, or any portion was or was not. And if it was not, then there shouldn't be a lead-based paint exhibit. If it was, then there should be. If you happen to have given them a lead-based paint exhibit, even though it says was not, then you better make sure it's right.
Okay.
Okay?
So it's better for you if you're a listing agent and your house was built after 1978.
Just don't do a lead-based paint whatsoever. Now, we talked about the booklets, right? We have the brochures for Protect Yourself in Buying a Home, what buyers should know about flood hazards. There's also the brochure about lead-based paint and about mold for that case, right?
Yeah.
Do we give those to everybody?
I would think so.
Absolutely. Why not? Our job is to educate our clients, right? So whether it might be applicable to this property or not, we want to give it to them. And in fact, as Liz pointed out, you're on a roll today. Okay. As Liz pointed out, we really should be giving them these pamphlets, these brochures, these educational pieces long before we identify what property we're making an offer on. So we're giving them a lead-based paint brochure because we want them to be educated so that as we look at properties, and one might be and one might not be built prior to 1978, they now have the knowledge that for them in their life, in their world, does that factor into making a decision or not? And so you've educated them. Don't wait until you write the contract to give them this stuff.
And I would also point out that it says to the best of the seller's knowledge. So we as the buyer broker have to look to the disclosure. And if the disclosure says was or was not, that's the
what gets
controlling info.
It
Not
is.
whether we know that it was built afterwards, but maybe, maybe not. It's whatever they tell us because it's on their knowledge, not ours.
It is.
the seller.
Now, again, our job is to protect our client. So if we know from our experience that these mantles were built, you know, these are from the 70s, I know that they are just because stylistically, whatever, I don't even know how to describe that, but let's just say we do, then we need to make sure that our client knows that. But again, if we've already given them that brochure when in our first meetings and in our first interaction of getting them going as a buyer, they're already educated on it. Mm-hmm. So they already know that that's an option. Okay?
Okay, so we've got an educational piece about lead-based paint, and we give them that, but we've also got some kind of disclaimer form that we do not give them unless it's 78 or earlier or ornamental things for today.
And we're going to cover that document, and so
Okay.
we'll go over a lot of detail with that at that point.
Okay.
But obviously it comes, and that's kind of the fun part about the contract, right? It all references something else, and so that's going to be in great detail, but right now we're going through kind of the surface parts.
Okay.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm clear, you're a listing agent, the house is built in 1985, and you know for a fact there's a mantle that's affixed, attached to the property, built in 1920, and all of a sudden the house is 78 or before.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Now, this is where this gets fun, and now you know what. We'll cover that when we get to disclosure, because the disclosures are an animal in and of themselves. Okay, so to Rob's point, this is to the seller's knowledge, and so we're reading off the disclosure. So from that standpoint, let's just say this one was not. Okay? Now, here's the other fun part. it has auto-filled in who represents the seller, the selling broker, and who's the listing broker here, because we put in the FMLS number, right? Remember? What it has not done, which is always interesting, it has not marked what kind of representation we have here. So let's talk quickly about our types of representation. There's client, there's customer, there's designated agent, and there's dual agent, right? Okay? Right here we've got two different brokerages, so are designated agent or dual agent options? No, because you have to be in the same brokerage for either of those to even be an option. So that leaves us with either representing the buyer as a client or not representing the buyer as a client, and therefore they are a customer. In our case, we want to be representing them as a buyer. Now, what about the listing agent? Do we know what kind of representation they have with their client?
No.
You sure?
Unless you can ask.
Well, I
Is it
would
on the
assume it as a client.
Is it on the listing somewhere?
Do we know the rules of FMLS?
Has to
If
be a
this
client.
property is listed in FMLS, by definition, it must be exclusively listed by the listing broker, which means they are representing them as a client. It is not an option for the FMLS to have customer listings in there. Okay, so if it's a listed property, then go ahead and mark them as. Really?
They timed out.
Where did I time out? I'm typing on it.
Or when you didn't save, but how do you save it?
It's not. All right. Well, let's go back in. Bobby Buyer. Yes. Come on.
Did you say that dual agent wasn't an option?
It's not in this case because it's two different brokerages. And I mean, so dual agent's also not an option if they're two different people. See, it's interesting.
It says
Say
it.
all of that.
It's not Coldwell Banker, it's BG.
It's BHG
Oh,
or
okay.
BHGRE Metro.
Yeah, I just scratched it out.
If it works.
If it were, it could be.
If it were, it could be designated. The only time it can be dual agent is what?
You're the
If it's just
listing
you,
Yeah. Which we don't do those.
which we
We
do
try
not
not
like to do at all.
Well,
Okay.
we do them,
We
right?
can, it's possible, because sometimes we back into it, unfortunately. But we really don't want
You
to.
don't want to.
Okay.
Well, if you get into that situation, call me. I feel like it's all right. For another.
All right, so material relationship disclosure. What do we put here?
I'm the cousin of the. I'm the cousin.
I mean, right? One of our best sources of business is our sphere of influence. Our sphere of influence is often populated with people that we're related to. Now, here's the question. What if this buyer is my best friend that I've known since, like, 2nd grade?
Doesn't matter.
Is that a material relationship?
No. Familiar.
Maybe not legally, but
If he thinks you're taking your money, he's going to go to somebody else.
if there's a relationship there that's beyond random people crossing in the night, shouldn't we disclose it?
Yeah, because there could be some influence.
Right? I mean, there's some level of influence. I mean, if this person's somebody that I've known since I was 4, there's not much difference between that and someone that, you know, is my brother, right? It's probably just as close.
Contract doesn't define a material relationship.
Doesn't. We're going to get to that. I know, Mr. Lawyer in the corner. Let's. But at this point, as we're filling out this blank, is it hurt anything? Does it hurt anything to say agent is buyer's childhood friend?
No.
That wouldn't be hurting. Does it weaken your position?
No.
No.
Adds credibility.
Does it actually maybe protect them from any kind of influence from the other side? because now other agent knows that, wow, your connection to this client is really solid, right?
But the other agent can't contact the client.
No, they can't.
No, they can't,
They
but they sure
shouldn't.
do.
Sometimes they
Yeah.
do.
Well, isn't that grounds for a complaint?
It
Oh,
is.
it is.
But that's the whole, but just from that standpoint, I think disclose, 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 disclose. Always disclose everything that might be possibly relevant, right? And when we get to disclosures, I'm going to go really deep into that. But the reality is that if this buyer is my childhood friend, I don't think it hurts to put it in there.
It's my mother-in-law's cousin's nephew's friend.
Right. You only have so much room, so So, or you want to put NA in here if it's not. Okay? Don't leave it blank.
Be glad you didn't meet my mother.
All right, last one. We're going to finish this page. Hell or high water, we're going to finish this page. The last one on this page is the time limit of the offer. This seems like a pretty easy one, right? It's going to take us a few minutes to get through. Time limit of the offer. It is very important that you understand the impact of the time limit. Okay? What factors factor into what you decide for a time limit? What day of the week it is? What time of day you're presenting the offer? I mean, if you're writing the offer up and you got to send it over to your clients and they're going to e-sign it when they get home from work and and you put noon tomorrow, I hope you aren't trying to have a good relationship with that other side, because that isn't going to start one. What's a good, typical, give people enough time to
48 hours.
respond?
48 hours.
About 48 hours, okay? That's usually enough. Now, when is that not enough?
Weekends or weekends.
A weekend might possibly, a holiday might possibly. What if the house is vacant? What's one of the things you might ask to generate goodwill with the other side? We're negotiating a little bit
See
here.
if the seller is still in town.
Is the seller in town? Is the seller out of state or out of country? What if the seller moved to China? 48 hours is not going to cut it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Other situations that we run into, a few of them. Sellers that don't do email and live in Florida. How are they going to respond to your offer in 48 hours?
Somebody's on active duty.
Somebody that's on active duty. So take a moment, play nice with the other side, and ask. Say, look, we're getting ready to write up an offer on your house, on your listing. When it comes to the time limit, are there any things that affect the seller's response that you need you need a longer time for? Now, the reality is if you ask that question and they say, yes, actually, my seller doesn't do email, and so I have to mail everything to them, and so, you really, I need at least 4 days, and you come back with 48 hours, that's really not good.
You look like a jerk.
You're going to be the jerk. Your negotiation just went out the window as far as any goodwill going back and forth, right? This is no longer a friendly negotiation. It's now a hostile environment.
Then you need to press your client to understand that.
And you need to make sure that your client understands why you are saying that you need to give the other side 4 days to respond. Okay? And so you need to create that, educate them on how that process goes. So typically 48 hours. Here's the other thing. I had somebody the other day write 11:59 p.m. on whatever the date was. Let's make a date. Would you want that to be your deadline?
No.
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 Somebody gonna call you at
Right?
11:30.
I mean, I don't want to be worried about getting a counter at 11:30 at night. right? Make the deadline a normal time. Now, what do you think the time should be for the deadline? 1 p.m.? What's the issue with 1 p.m.?
Middle of the day.
People may be at work.
People might be at work. It might be challenging for them to do that.
6 o'clock.
8 o'clock.
6 o'clock, 8 o'clock. All valid responses. Because the other thing is if you've given them a good full 48 hours, 1 o'clock on the second day, they should have been able to figure it out the night before, right? And then they get it over to their client, their agent, and the agent gets it to you that morning, and they're good to go. Okay, so it really just matters as to kind of how you want to work, different things, whatever. It doesn't matter. Okay. Again, it's a negotiation. It's part of the process. All right, so we have made it through page 1 of our 7-page contract. Please make sure that next time you come, you bring your packet with you, and take the time to read it before you come in next time, so that there's some understanding before we try to dig deep into it, because we are going to dig deep into it.
How many pages are we doing next?
I don't know. It depends on how fast we can get through. All right?
I don't remember.
Just
Well, I need to know how many pages to read.
read the whole thing. All right. Thank you guys for coming. See you next week.